Please join me in welcoming Christine Hale.
Thank you, and thank you so much to Malaprops. I'm so grateful for Malaprops still being here and supporting writers continually. Thankful to everybody who came here in person tonight, and really thankful to everybody who's out there online. And of course, I'm grateful to WTAW Press for making this book possible and for being a longtime supporter of Mac's work. A craft book from McIvoy. I'm gonna guess that almost everybody here knew Mac as person and student, and hopefully probably even almost everybody online. So, you know, I don't necessarily have to explain that a craft book from Mac is more like the Zen master's offering. And so Dale and I want to talk about it as a craft book, but also as some life, something on life. And before I fall quiet for a moment, I wanted to say that I recently found in one of Mac's very old journals a place where he had jotted down this quote. This is not his words, but I thought this so much describes who he was as teacher and writer. So, quote, "This is how the mystic lives, seeing the magic, changing the environment with the mind, and allowing actions, even actions of the imagination, to have significance." And that's, it was from the Yoga of Dreams. I'm not sure which yogi master that was. I got an idea, but I can't attribute it properly. But anyway, does that not sound like Mac? Right? The mystic and the man of rigorous writing advice and revision. And so I'm not Dale, march on that one.
Okay, thanks, Kristen. I'm just so glad to be here, and I'm glad y'all are right here too. This book is just a wonder. You know, I've known Mac for a number of years, and I had lots of lunches with him at various places around. We talked about a lot about writing. I think the first time I actually worked with him was back about 2013, and I took one of his workshops here in town. And all he did was sort of concentrate on the first sentence. First sentence, right? And this was actually when I was working on Appalachian Book of the Dead, and it's got a pretty, you know, nice opening to it, I think. But he kept saying, you know, can you put more into it? Can you put more into it? And that's sort of when I got this idea that, you know, this guy wasn't your usual craft teacher. I think, you know, most craft books, I think writers love craft books. They want a shortcut, you know. What we really want is 10 easy ways to write a bestseller. Right? Please give us that, you know. Mac doesn't give you that. Like, he gives you what you don't think you don't expect. And here's one of the most radical things I think in the book for me. And there's lots of things in this book, lots of things, and we'll get to some of it. But here's Mac. I think the temptation when you're writing prose is to create a push and glide effect in language that gets you from here to there, that introduces this idea or this character, that moves you into this space, this setting, and grounds you there, that orients you in time and serves you in moving forward through the story. Now, that's one way of composing. Another way of composing is to write a sentence and to really live inside that sentence, to pay attention to it, what its sonic values are, what the characteristics of its autopoiesis are, before you allow yourself to write the next sentence and the next. And when you revise, instead of saying, how is this sentence helping the reader push and glide through the work, you ask yourself, how is this sentence shifting the reader's intimate experience towards radical decentering? How is it a thing of slender passing of beauty? A sentence that will, if you will be inside of it for just a second more, no matter what your inclination as a reader, be an experience dark and luminous on its own terms. Okay. That's strange. Okay. You don't hear many writing teachers telling you, can you put more into the sentence? Can you disorient us a little more before you orient us, you know? And coming from a long background in journalism, that ain't gonna fly, right? Love this. So I think, a lot of what Mac is talking about is opening up the writer to, new ideas. I mean, that's the hardest thing. And he talks a lot about that beginner's mind, from, the Zen Buddhism. The expert only knows one way to do it, right? The beginner's mind, the beginner doesn't know. So there's all these different options. And I think what always impressed me, or looking at all Mac's work, after his passing, he did keep circling around this idea of writers of completeness and writers of fullness. These were kind of his sort of phrases here. And he would always be asking hard questions. What kind of writer are you? Are you a writer aiming for completeness? Are you crafting stories with well-defined plots, moving efficiently to that satisfying ending, and always careful to adjust the language to make your point? Are you following in the footsteps of, say, Tolstoy or Fitzgerald or Flannery O'Connor or Raymond Carver or James Salter? Or perhaps your aesthetic reaches more for what Mac liked to call fullness. You often create these messy stories with these centrifugal forces that resist his easy endings with language that is playful above all. Maybe those lodestars in that genre would include Dostoevsky and Faulkner and Cather, and one of his favorites, Clarice Lispector. Now it's not an either or, it's a spectrum, so completeness, versus fullness. And reading through this book, about willingness, where is the writer in all this? What you're asking yourself these harder questions when you revise. There's not one way to do it. There are no rules. So how are you going to find your way through it? I think what Chris was able to do with this book is put together this sort of back and forth. It's not quite a dialogue or dichotomy or whatever, but they're both faces of the same coin, right? One or the other. You have to keep sort of finding your middle way there. And so I think Mac always tried to disabuse writers that there's just one way to do this. And I think everybody, I know I do. I fall into it. I got to do this. Right? This is the way this goes. And he's not taken, but he doesn't like that kind of efficient sort of surface prose that gets you there as quickly as possible. He's more interested in that kind of image that actually stops you in the book. There's some books you read that are like page turners, you can't help yourself. Sometimes they're not really that surprising. I know what's going to happen. I can't stop, So there's almost the curse of the page turner. And then all of a sudden you hit phrase, an image where a moment of stillness and you stop reading. All of a sudden you stop in the story. There's this moment you're looking out the window before you go back to it. And I think that's what Mac is talking about with this idea of fullness, which I think is where, and he took it a step further with more of a wisdom tradition too, that you could look there too.
Yeah, and that there's a permission to writers to be different than the received norms. And lots of us felt extremely liberated by hearing that and greatly encouraged by it. Do you mind if I yabber on about it? Yeah, so speaking of the most radical things and speaking of other ways to do it, probably one of the most radical things I heard him say as a teacher of writing was that, this is a quote in the book, "I do sincerely believe," Mac said, "that almost all of the energies of plot are replaceable in a story. Still, I believe the storyteller whose work even mildly suspends elements of plot must discover in the work what will replace plot energy with another energy every bit as dynamic." So what could that possibly be that's as dynamic as plot, especially sort of in the zeitgeist we have now? So this idea of looking for fullness, looking at that, living in that sentence and finding what else you might work with there, led me to think about co-consciousness, which was something he talked often about and something that I honestly didn't understand until I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of it now after putting the book together and making my way through so very many materials. I think for a long time I confused the idea or conflated the idea of co-consciousness with the tribal omniscience, and they're not unrelated, but because a tribal omniscience is a we voice, and there is a co-consciousness in that tribe. But co-consciousness, I think, as a practical matter for the writer, means paying attention to the layers of voice that are in the voice that your character is speaking with. And also paying attention to what he called the talismanic object, or the delicate object, or the charged object. So about the layered voices, let's see if I can find my good. He says, there is never really something we can accurately call dialogue. A third force and a fourth and a fifth is always present, since we cannot avoid speaking with a voice that is made up of multiple voices, and since none of us ever addresses only one other person, we are unavoidably self-addressing in any circumstance in which we seem to be addressing. I sing, Bretty, Bretty, it's good to see you, Bretty. But without saying it openly, I am also asking the Bretty who knows me so well and loathes me, the old friend Bretty, who was a loving friend for so many years. Bretty, are you happy to see me? And deep inside me, I'm singing to the McIvoy who sees her now. What have you done, Mac? Why did you ever ask her that? I have repeated her name, you notice. I'm singing her name for me. And I'm singing it for Bretty too. It's good to hear someone sing your own name to you. And I'm singing her name for all of the people Bretty and I mutually know who are not there, but who implicitly join our company whenever Bretty and I are in each other's company. These are dramas, intensifications of ordinary experience. So I was grateful to have a little bit of understanding of that. And about the talismanic object or the charged object, he says, some of you have read Gogol's Overcoat, but that kind of thing where there is, he says, it is a drama complete unto itself when the talismanic object, which is something passed from one person to another among family, or the focus of obsession, as in Gogol's Overcoat, when that object receives the individual's or the group's fixed and sustained attention. Obsession is a compelling drama complementary to larger dramas. The object obsession helps make the work's mysteries recognizable and meaningful. When the writer fully commits to the singular drama of object obsession by eschewing the presence of other dramas, the work's mysteries can become dreamlike and even mystical. So to me, that says when you're hanging out, living in that sentence that Dale cited, you can look for the possibilities of those layered voices, and you can decide to do more with that instead of going with plot if you want to. And you can decide to follow object obsession. Object obsession, how many people remember Mac's story, the people who own pianos? Yeah, it's in that's in Complete History of New Mexico. So there's some object obsession for you, and the most F-bombs per square millimeter. But that shows you what is possible. It's a beloved story, I think, by anybody who ever heard him read it. But shows you what is possible when working with the ideas of co-consciousness. And before I hand it back to Dale, I just want to say, if you've just bought the book or you're getting the book, be sure to look at the extras in the back. There are some of those famous lecture letters, but also some writing exercises, a selection of writing exercises, including a trialogue exercise, which might help you actually create some of those layered voices. And so you were going to talk about the will of the work.
The will of the work, yes. And that goes back to, the title of the book, Willingness. And that Mac was, I think trying to disabuse writers of the notion they have to control everything. There are these sort of gods in the background. You've got to make it all happen. And everybody, I think Malaprop used to call his characters his galley slaves and that sort of thing. And I think Mac is saying, you know, you don't have to be so in charge of everything. Again, completeness is not, you know, a bad thing, whatever. There's lots of great writers moving in that direction, but you can go maybe too far in that direction. And I think in our time now is that, you know, that glide and push kind of language, you know who does that really well is AI, right? So, I mean, so I think writers will have to pay attention. Why do you want to write something that a machine could do, you know, quicker than you, right? And I think that, you know, that gives you a little bit more to think about. But, you know, he comes up with these radical ideas that I believe a manuscript represents a dynamic convergence of the author's will, the will of the work itself, and the will of the reader, okay? So again, it's more of those varied voices there. And I'd heard that early on. I like to say that to my students as well. The story is smarter than you, right? As you keep working on it, you don't know everything. And the story will start saying, hey, over here, why don't you try this? Or what if that happened or whatever? You know, the reader wishes for fiction to generate comprehensible and ineffable human mysteries, to welcome the inward and outward journeys that are resolvable, comic, and irreconcilable, tragic, and to sound language's clear root notes, its chords, and its engaging, estranging silences. Yeah, I mean, that sounds like that back and forth there. You know, the work itself wishes to present the spectacles of becoming and the dramas of being, to reveal the selves, the illusions of self, and the true self of the characters and the world of the characters, to be a living organism that invites physical responses as well as cerebral reactions. A draft presents a process of discovery about the characters, voice, perspective, ways of being, but equally about you as a writer and as a person. What do you seem to intuitively value in this particular work? And how is your will asserting itself? In looking at your complete draft, notice first what you control and fail to control. Your relationship to the characters, the story, and its audience, your stance, your distance, your philosophy, or the absence of any of these, and your role in the world of this work. Are you a transcriber, a translator, a transformer? You know, everyone says universally to writers, how do you know when you're done? And the writers who are honest always say, I never know when I'm done. I just have a sense that I brought to bear all the skills I have at the moment, and I am honest with myself about that. So, what I keep hearing as this book goes on is, you know, the questions get directed more not to the story, the novel, the piece of prose, or the poem that you're working on, but about you, right? It's about the writer and what you think, right? As I heard, you know, when we talk about plot, I think, you know, I heard Charlie Baxter once say, plot is just your aesthetic, really. It's your vision of how the world works, you know. And so when we're writing these novels, when we're writing these essays, when we're writing these poems, we are telling people what we think about the world we live in, you know. And I think those are the harder questions. And so it's always, you know, dismaying when the characters don't quite cooperate, you know, on a daily basis, or they seem stuck or whatever. And I think Max was saying the problem is maybe not with the characters, you know, you're working out your own sort of interior sort of questions here.
Yeah, and he would say that writer block, that dreaded thing, comes partly from the self-created paralysis, that's my words, not his, of insisting on your will over the will of the book. He said about that, well, he had the title Willingness of a book about writing at least as early as the year 2000. I discovered this in going through files. He conceived of it in a different way than it would have come to be if he had finished writing it in his 70th year, when he'd become much more of a Buddhist. And of course, what I have created using his words is something, it's not what he would have written, sorry. But anyway, with respect to the will of the work and the will of the writer, He said, if you give first priority to locating the problems in your early draft, you will correct the draft, repairing and repairing the boat, which is the embodiment of your controls, technical skills, before you have gazed into the extraordinary qualities of the river, the embodiment of your inventive capabilities, always carrying you beyond what you can consciously control. You have placed your will over the will of the work. You are outside the work, answering and inventorying, feeling assured you are addressing your novel's problems. You are being a hard ass. You are not inside the work, questioning and inventing, feeling emboldened to explore your novel's possibilities. So if you look in the extras in the back of the book, you will see a document called Terms of Engagement Between Author and Editor that he wrote sometime, I think in the 2000s. Another, to me, radical experience of Mac as teacher and human being was his affection for silences and then for white spaces in the texts. And Pete Turchi in his, excuse me, in his introduction to the book said this about silence. He said, he was my colleague at Warren Wilson MFA program. The first class of his I remember, Pete says, was on silence. I vividly remember thinking as I entered the room, how will he possibly talk about this for 75 minutes? And thinking as I left the room, he could have gone on for 3 hours. So the value of silence. It's a little bit of a longer passage, but I think it explains it well. What we do not express matters as much as what we do. Let's say this Thanksgiving, our eccentric but beloved cousin has brought once again his special homemade biscuits, a very large basket of inedible biscuits. As he does every Thanksgiving, he asks, want me to pass them around again? And his question is met with silence. Then a nervous remark from one of us about weight watching, then others joining in about gaining so much weight during the holidays. We feel that the little island of silence is affectionate, that it increases our connection to our cousin. And so it increases love among all of us at the table. Excuse me. And so it increases love among all of us at the table who love him. This is an engaging silence. Yeah. Let's say a little time passes and he mutters, I'm sending them around again. We can feel that the answering silence is still engaging, but it lasts a beat longer than anything else, before anything else is said. There is a subtext. Oh, dear cousin, we sure wish just for a second we could disappear, eliminate ourselves from this familiar tableau, not have to hurt your feelings either directly or indirectly. This is an erasing silence. And now, as everyone is finishing eating, our cousin says, a little indignantly, last call for my biscuits. He has done this every Thanksgiving. Every Thanksgiving, he has brought the biscuits no one has been able to eat. He has eternally taken offense. And this Thanksgiving, he has taken offense again. And for a moment, so have we. The silence of the group is the longest one yet. It is a protesting silence. I need to turn the page here. I was not going to do. He says that any writer who has ever had any musical training knows that where the silences land, whether overt silences that manifest themselves in space breaks, covert silences that have to do with the ending of this sentence and the beginning of the next, silences that are made very definite by chaptering, and silences that occur at a pre-climactic moment and a post-climactic moment. These change the terms of engagement. Poets, of course, learn how to trust silence so much that they have a sense of the pressure sonically on either side of the silence, the created gap that has energy, the leap that has energy. I never thought of chapter breaks as a form of silence. And then he goes on to talk about how he uses white space. My use of white space, he says, offers a graphic distinction from so-called normal presentation. It uses paragraphing as attention to tonal clusters rather than as building blocks of theme or as the foundation, the centering and supporting walls of plot. Then, with attention to revision and white spaces, he says, I examined the white spaces in my drafts to remind myself that my shared experience with the character was incomplete, though I may have thought it was complete. In those white spaces, I can intuit what I do not know about the characters, what the narrator of the work cannot articulate, for instance, about his or her motivations. These unknowable, inexpressible parts of the text often present good doubt, a reminder that a unique narrative voice is defined as much as by what is not said as by what is said. When we're rereading our story drafts, we must, of course, pay attention to the white spaces that are just bad debt, a place of self-centered censorship, for instance, that should be paid off. But we should pay attention to the places of good doubt. In the white spaces in my drafts, I can see what risks I took by erasing text and what risks I avoided. How do you make these space decisions in your work? Where do you make most of them? In composing, in revising, more in your early drafts than in the final ones? And what do they mean? You could ask yourself what might go where the space is. Setting, passing of time, the character at last alone, not in scene with other characters. Suppose a section ends with a character eating an egg sandwich at 4 a.m. How does the room look? What does 4 a.m. in winter in Roswell, New Mexico feel like? Is it possible that the story the characters want to write exists in these spaces while you willfully write the story that you meant to write? So I'm hoping that that is illustrative of how you could make practical use of this strange advice.
So as you can sort of tell, no 10 easy ways to get to the bestseller. That's what this book does, but I think as this book goes along here, you do get a sense that there is a payoff for the writer, according to Mac. And towards the end, he starts talking about what he calls the long gaze. Part of the joy of writing is remaking who you are as a human being and understanding that the opportunity to undo your life, to enter new uncertainties, is a great blessing, a great gift. There's a payoff for the writer here. And he goes through the book often talking about, he's not had lots and lots of commercial success compared to other people. He's had lots of failures, but that is part of being alive. He's had ups and downs. That's part of being alive. But again, the writing has enriched all that living. And he talks about, what John Berryman had called the stance of wonder, trying to get into that space where the world doesn't oppress you, but you look at it and wonder. We live in the world most of the time by thinking ahead to what comes next instead of stopping in a stance of wonder and being in that moment. This is part of the discipline of being a writer, to constantly, every day and well outside of the writing time, in the time that you're just moving through the world, to say, how will I reside in language differently than I did yesterday? How will I listen differently than I listened yesterday? This is why I believe the life of the artist is inherently a life of pleasure. When I hear people talk about the suffering that is involved in their work, I don't take that for granted, but I don't identify. For me, suffering is part of living fully. Part of being alive is pleasurable, but when you're fully alive, if you are fully alive when you're miserable, you are experiencing something pleasurable. That is paradoxical, and paradox is the very essence of really rich art. It is pleasurable to experience beauty and be destabilized. Everything in an artist's life in general has to do with the degree to which you perfect your capacity for the long gaze. To practice the long gaze, not just when you're writing, but in every waking and if possible, every dreaming second of your life. To take not just the opportunity, but the responsibility for the long gaze. Because, especially for us in American culture, the temptation is to look at and look past immediately everything that comes before us. Everything that presents itself before us, we glance at. We are already looking from some other value. And so There is notes of activism in here. There are notes of cultural sort of criticism in here about how we think stories should go in America, how writers should do stories in America. You know, we do have sort of a story system that's infected with capitalism. What's the payoff, right? You know, what's the return on investment here? What's, you know, and these are real questions, you know, when I'm writing a book, you know, you realize that you're asking someone to give you 8 hours of their life to read the book. You know, what are you giving them in exchange? And I think you can't predict that. Will the work, you know, the work, will of the reader, you know, the will of the editor, will of the writer, it's all sort of bounce around with each other. But there is this payoff for the writer. You become a different person as you write and with these kind of questions. And I think that's sort of the genius of Mac's teaching. You know, he wasn't just making better writers. In his own way, I think he was making people, you know, took this life and making better people. So this is not a book about wordcraft, you know, but more about soulcraft. And that is the payoff with a writer, you know, in case anyone's wondering. You know.
Yeah, there is, as a teacher of writers for many, many years, I observed a lot of suffering. My own and other people's. And, you know, I mean, it's harsh, the life of artists, not just writers. But so some search for the payoff, the soul work is a good thing to be reminded of in the world. We're getting close to our question moment. I was going to say that there's so much that we haven't been able to touch on yet. I want to again mention the extras. In the extras, you'll find Mac's teaching philosophy. You'll find the contrasting qualities of the novel, the short story, and the novella. And some of you will remember that Mac very strongly believed that the novella was not just a short novel. It was something that had special gifts and attributes and opportunities. We haven't talked about too much about engine and enigma. We haven't talked about wabi and sabi, the comic mode, imminence, uppercase and lowercase God, good sex, the one reader, revising for time and space. We just mentioned paradox. We haven't gotten into dynamic balance, so there's a lot. There's a lot there. Let's see if Madeline is around. Oh, I guess I would pause for questions. I'll just say that another thing that I want you not to forget that Mac would urge is be in the dynamic condition of doubt as you compose and revise. Futility is the generative starting place for many powerful works of art. Futility.
That's a nice thing. You don't have to know what you're doing when you're writing. Knowing what you're doing may get in the way, you know, sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah, make you stop.
You know, which, you know, we sort of it can take the pressure off of you, right? You know, this is play. And so, you know, when he starts talking about luminous darkness, I get the sense of going and playing in the dark, you know, when you're running through the woods on a full moon. It's exhilarating, you know, and I think that's what Mac allows a writer to do, to be exhilarated by you don't know. So we're back to Keats's negative capability again.
Yeah, he mentions that. I had to learn it took me a long time to learn what negative capability meant. I kept reading it. Do we have questions here?
Could you describe your process of compiling the book from the manuscripts, which I imagine were probably in various states of completion and incompletion?
Yeah, thank you. So the question is to describe the process of putting the book together. So as I mentioned, Mac had the idea of writing the book Willingness for over 20 years. And during the last year of his life, he was finally getting going on it. And he had talked to me about what he wanted it to be. He mentioned Italo Calvino's 6 Memos for the Millennium as a kind of guide for that. If you haven't read that, oh, writers, I send you that way. And he also said that he wished it to be a record of a process of searching and not a prescriptive writing book. he left about 3 or 4 completed pieces in it. I've identified them, I think, in my foreword, and I can't be relied upon to remember that right this moment. I knew that I would be using material from his lectures delivered at Warren Wilson, which there were scripts of those. There were other interviews that were done, printed interviews, published interviews that had been done with him in the last 3 or 4 years of his life that were quite comprehensive, where he talked about his own life. I mean, I learned things from those interviews I didn't know about him. You will too. Not anything like, salacious, but interesting things about his experience with seizures, for instance, as a child, how many years he had been plagued by seizures and how that changed his mind and so forth. So anyway, when the publisher asked me how far along he was with the book, and I realized not very far at all, and she asked me if I could finish it, and I thought, I can't possibly do that, but I want to try, because it's his legacy. It's this, a friend of his and former client said that I was his translator, quasi-biographer, archivist, publicist, and interpreter. I tried. Yeah. So anyway, I had his computer, and which I could look into it for the electronic drafts. I had my memories of his conversations with me about what he wished to have included, such things as the in 152 words, everything McIvoy ever taught, which is sort of the framework for the book. So I began by making a sort of a glossary of all the terms I could think of his having used, such as dynamic balance and engine and enigma, pulling those out of things that I read, but also remembering, until I had this massive list of many, many pages. And then I went looking for his language on those concepts, because I had realized, made a vow to myself, that I wouldn't put my voice in the book, because then it wouldn't be his book. Right? It's got enough of me in the arrangement, but all the words in there are his. So I had to go, in some cases, I really had to go pawing through a lot of stuff to find words that adequately addressed some particular topic. There were stacks of manila file folders, like this high, about 4 of them. There was a lot of duplication. The person who worked with him was remembering, and there's a lot of other stuff in there, like receipts and notes to self, yeah. So there was a lot of paper to go through, and then in a few cases I needed to use letters to students that were still available where I could to find something. So it was a massive forensic research job, and then putting together of a collage manuscript. And I felt lucky that, I've written 2 books that are really collaged. And so I felt I knew how to do that. It took several drafts. So that's how it came to be. Thank you for asking. Other questions? We have online questions, or not so much? No? Nobody wants me to try to do an explainer on something. Wants me to follow my face.
Is there any way I could offer a little tribute?
Sure.
So I met Mac in 2002. I showed up.
Can they hear her? You want to come over here? Sure. This is Leslie Heiser. Hi. Yeah.
I don't cry. Well, I met him in 2002, and actually I moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, and I had accepted a job as the development officer for the university library. But I had also had an essay accepted in Puerto del Sol, which is what induced me to check out the university and eventually apply for this job and get it. And so when I met Mac, he had already read my piece, which was about this extraordinary experience that I had living in the Andes Mountains previously and working on a human rights project with local people. and eventually not only accepted it for Portrait del Sol, but for the 40th anniversary anthology, which was a huge honor. But while I was there, I sort of semi-enrolled in the MFA program and started to study with Mac. So that was more than 20 years ago. And I guess one thing I'd like to say is like how he recognized like a version of me that was much that I've been able to live into. You know what I mean? And that did so much for me. And just him being of elsewhere and offering so much that was beautiful and different.
Yeah.
And this did so much for me. And I continued to study with him in New Mexico, but I was only there for 3 years. And then I moved to Maine with my husband. And a really cool thing was Mac offered this big, not big, but this like 5 or 6 days in Santa Fe once. And I went out there and I studied with him there. And we talked about, to tie in with something that you were talking about, we talked at length about how in War and Peace, there are 12 pages devoted to a meditation on clouds, which I guess is a kind of silence or just something different. But anyway, I don't want to distract from the real purpose of the event, but I just thought it might be nice to offer my gratitude as a student.
Yeah.
And as a friend.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, he listened, right? He listened and he could see versions of people and versions of books that the person themselves could not see. And that was partly because of his affection for silence and partly because of his long training, very highly disciplined training about listening, which makes me remember in the extras, there are the instructions for voice collection. Very detailed, and if you should wish to really go looking for the speech rhythms, you would find the how to do it in voice collections. And I listened to the voice collections of his parents. I found those in his study. And, you know, I didn't know his father. I had known his mother at the end of her life. But wow, those voice collections, I mean, that's basically just interviewing somebody, but doing the kind of leading questions that encourages them to reveal things about them, reveal their inner workings. So let's see, where are we coming down to time? Something else you wanted to say?
There's parts of this book I do not get. Okay. Some of this stuff started flying over my head when he started talking about time. And he was starting to pull in philosophers like Heidegger and Whitehead and this idea of radical decentering. He's, you know, Simone Bay and
Lane
Scar, you know, and so on. And, you know, some of this, you know, I began to have appreciation for how much he had thought through this and researched this and read so much about this. Because some of this starts to, you know, can sound like, oh, come on, Mac. Give me a break. Come on, give me a break here. I mean, you know,
the sections on time go over my head.
They do, but they seem to work too, because you start to realize in the same way there's various you know ways you can get at character, and there's different voices. There's various ways that, you know, time's portrayed. You know, time is not just a linear thing that we keep clicking along with. And of course, a novel can make time do most anything, and so becoming more aware of that. Reading this book, I just got just sort of, it was inspiring. It's like, oh, I can do things here.
Yeah.
I can do, you know, it does get you out of your sort of preconceptions. This is how I write books. This is how books are written. This is how you do these things. And what happens if you try something different? You know, and that's a very practical sort of advice there, is try something different. You know, look at look at the flaws first. Don't try and get rid of all the flaws. What if there's something there? So he does have this sort of, I think it was one of the completed passages about the overplus.
That's the last section of the book.
You know, and it was like, you know, Tolstoy's, you know, meditation on the clouds. You know, what's that doing in the book? You know, you don't need that. Writer doesn't need that. But Mac's saying sometimes the writer doesn't know what they want. You know, what if you give them something they didn't know they wanted? What if you write something you didn't know you needed to put in there? What if you add something? You know, so that makes the book even more rich, you know. We're not in control of it. You know, I can't, even after I write the book, I can't control how you read it, right?
Mhm.
So this makes the whole experience of writing books, reading books. I mean, this is a marvelous thing, right? You know, when you think about it. And that we were able to share like our deep sort of suspicions about the world, our senses, our sensations. And it's like a mind meld when you start to understand how Tolstoy's looking at things, you understand how Chekhov's looking at things, and it's just marvelous. And I think that's sort of, you know, that exhilaration that
Mhm.
early on, I think readers find. And writers are just readers who need to emulate, right?
Yeah.
And Bella
Yeah.
said that, so.
Yeah, yeah, and it, in hard times like these, we need some joys. And, I find joy, in reading old novels, for instance, some of you remember Mac's affection for Willa Cather as an author, and so there's an electronic version of the complete works of Willa Cather in his Kindle, which I started reading. I'd only read a little bit of Willa Cather ever before, recently, and you know, it's a place I can go to escape doom scrolling. Yes.
We have a question online.
Okay. Wonderful.
It's a question for you. Did Mac ever talk about how the land around him, from Mexico, North Carolina, and other places in between, influenced or changed him as a writer?
Not specifically, but it is remarkable. I think Dale and I had a conversation about him having made himself into a North Carolina writer, you know, and after being such a desert-based writer, with Hyssop and so many of the stories of Complete History of New Mexico, and also with some of the 57 Octaves ones. But what he said somewhere that he said McIvoy is capable of reinventing himself. He rather frequently spoke of himself in the third person, not to me, but in the journals. And so he reinvented as a North Carolina writer. When he came here, everything was lost. The big sky was lost. A lot of other stuff was lost. And he came and he dug into the beauty of the mountains and to the gnarly history of the racial history of North Carolina in one kind favor. So because he was listening to people and because he was paying attention to the world, he was going to be profoundly influenced, I think, by setting in any circumstance. And you know, that when you read Fifth Station and some of the other stories, you can find the Midwest roots in there, right? He had not much affection for the Midwest. And I think a great affection for the desert and a great affection for the mountains. I hope that's a helpful answer. He was a person of tremendous will and a person of tremendous imagination and resilience. And just a quick note about the time, I mean, about his writing so much and thinking so much about time. It's quoted in the book from an interview where he says he became a student of time all his life from childhood on because he had so many seizures up till the age of, I think, 9 or 11. I've kind of forgotten that number exactly. But he said with the seizures, he never knew they were coming. What he remembered was waking up, coming back into the world. And that time of the onset of the seizure and during the seizure was just gone. And he said, teachers, my brothers, my friends would always ask me, what's it like, the seizure? And so time was discontinuous for him. And he often said to me, I think I experience time differently than you do, Chris. I'm fine. Yep, you do. But he also says at the end of that long section on time, you don't need to memorize all this philosophical detail about the subjectivity of time. He says, if we think too much, we can't write a damn thing. But reading, having your mind expanded and blown from time to time away from your composing and revising process lets you go back knowing something different and having been changed a little bit. Yeah, I'm coming down to the last bit. I want to give 2 sets of last words. And before I do that, I'm just going to quickly urge you to buy books from Malaprops. Buy copies of Willingness, give them to your friends and neighbors. Dale's and my books are back there as well. If you want old stock of Mac's books published for 2018, I have some copies here. You can see me afterwards. So Pete Turchi, in his wonderful, generous introduction to the book, says this about working with willingness. This is a book to spend time with, to contemplate, to return to. We should not merely accept this book, this gift, as if it were a comfortable sweater or a beloved cousin's inedible biscuits. We should argue with it, find fault with it. We should adjust it to fit. We should value its mysteries as much as its mastery. We should recognize it as an act of devotion shared with us. And Pete says he feels sure that Mac would agree with that, and I do too. You know, you don't have to take it as gospel, take it as something to chew on. Mac says in the book, "You already know this. Any specific advice I offer you will be welcomed and not welcomed, invaluable and useless, serious and foolish. If my ill-advised advice will provide a way for you to re-enter your draft and ask from within it how to more deeply respect its paradoxes, I regret, celebrate those blessed, cursed conditions." Thank you very much, and thank you all the people out in the ether land. So I think we're ready for purchases and maybe some ideas. Thank you.